60 seconds. That's all it took for 3 generations of farming legacy to vanish on the courthouse steps, while the entire county drowned themselves in million-dollar loans and shiny green tractors. One old man was quietly burying mason jars in his orchard. They called him a lunatic. They were dead wrong. In the sprawling, sun-baked expanse of Henderson County, Illinois, success was measured in iron and acreage. It was the spring of 2021, and agricultural money had never been cheaper. Interest rates were practically invisible, hovering near zero, and the local bank branches were handing out agricultural expansion loans like candy at a parade. If you weren't expanding, you were dying. That was the gospel, according to modern agriculture. At the center of this debt-fueled renaissance was Gregory Carmichael. At 45, Gregory was the golden boy of the county. He drove a pristine, midnight blue Ford F-250 Platinum, ran a farming operation that spanned nearly 5,000 acres, and had just signed a lease agreement for 3 $500,000 John Deere X9 combines. Gregory operated on leverage. He believed that with crop prices soaring, the only logical move was to borrow to the hilt, buy out the smaller guys, and dominate the valley. And then there was William Paul. William was 72 years old, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of the very limestone that lined the county creeks. He had farmed his family's 800-acre plot, Willow Creek Farms, for 50 years. He was respected, if a bit solitary. But in November of that year, William Paul did something that made the entire town think he had suffered a silent stroke. He called an auctioneer, not just any auctioneer, but Tommy Henderson, the most aggressive liquidator in the tri-state area. When the bright yellow auction flyers went up in the window of the local hardware store and the diner, the locals thought it was a retirement sale. But William wasn't retiring. He was purging. On a crisp Tuesday morning, trucks lined the gravel road leading to William's barn for 2 miles. Gregory Carmichael stood near the front, sipping coffee from a Yeti thermos, a smug grin plastered across his face. Before the crowd's bewildered eyes, William sold off almost everything that made a modern farm function. He sold his GPS-guided planters. He sold his 3-year-old combine. He sold his massive 4-wheel drive articulated tractors. He even sold his massive steel grain bins to a dismantling crew. "William, what in the hell are you doing?" Tommy Henderson had asked him privately before stepping up to the microphone. "This equipment is prime. You've still got 5 years of depreciation left on that deer. You're taking a bath on the taxes." William had just looked out over his fields, his pale blue eyes unblinking. "The weather is changing, Tommy. Not the rain. The paper. The paper weather is turning cold." By the end of the day, William had liquidated over $2 million worth of modern machinery. But the true shock came the following week. William marched into the Henderson County Assessor's office and officially transferred 400 acres of his prime flat bottomland, the best soil in the county, to Gregory Carmichael. Gregory had bought it using a massive line of credit from Heartland Ag Credit, paying top dollar, completely convinced he had just fleeced a senile old man. "He's lost his marbles." Gregory laughed loudly at the county diner a few days later, buying a round of pie for the room. "The old fool is keeping the rocky hillside and the woods, and practically giving me the high-yield dirt. He says he's going to farm the rest with junk." And junk was exactly what William bought. A month after the massive liquidation, a flatbed trailer arrived at Willow Creek Farms, carrying 2 rusted, 40-year-old International Harvester 1066 tractors. They had no computers, no climate control, and no satellite guidance. They leaked oil and smelled like burnt diesel. William spent the winter in his barn, covered in grease, rebuilding the engines by hand with his daughter Selena, who had recently moved back from Chicago after a brutal corporate layoff. The town watched in morbid fascination. William was seen going to the First National Bank of Peoria, closing his operating lines of credit and paying off every single dime he owed. He walked out of the bank with zero debt, a cashier's check for the remainder of his land sale, and a deeply unsettling calm. Rumors began to swirl. The mail carrier, a woman named Beatrice, swore she saw William out in his apple orchard at midnight, digging deep trenches with a backhoe and burying thick-sealed PVC pipes. The hardware store owner reported William buying thousands of dollars in heirloom seeds, hand tools, and a massive industrial-grade manual water pump. He's a doomsday prepper, the town concluded. Dementia mixed with paranoia. Instead of planting wall-to-wall genetically modified corn, William planted a bizarre, chaotic mixture of cover crops, clover, winter wheat, radishes, letting them rot into the soil. He bought a small herd of 50 heritage cattle and just let them graze the remaining acres. He wasn't maximizing yield. He was intentionally shrinking his operation to a fraction of its potential. Meanwhile, Gregory Carmichael was riding high. The 2022 harvest was decent, and despite a slight dip in commodity prices, Gregory's sheer volume kept the cash flowing. He bought another 500 acres. He took out another massive variable-rate loan to build a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled equipment shed. Whenever Gregory's shiny new fleet drove past William's property, Gregory would honk his horn, laughing at the sight of the old man on his rusted open-cab tractor, breathing in dust. "Look at the lunatic," Gregory would tell his farmhands. "That's what happens when you refuse to evolve. The future belongs to the bold." But William wasn't refusing to evolve. He was preparing for an extinction event. The crack in the foundation of Henderson County didn't start with a crash. It started with a whisper, buried deep in the financial pages that most farmers never read. In early 2023, inflation, which had been dismissed as transitory, suddenly dug its claws into the global economy. To combat the spiraling costs, the Federal Reserve began hiking interest rates. It was a slow drip, at first a quarter point here, a half point there. But by the fall, the prime rate had skyrocketed. For the average citizen, it meant an expensive mortgage. But for mega farmers like Gregory Carmichael, who were floating on millions of dollars of variable rate operating debt, it was a death sentence. Gregory sat in his luxurious home office in November 2023, staring at a letter from Heartland Ag Credit. His hands, usually steady and calloused, were trembling. His annual interest payments on his land and equipment loans had just doubled. In a matter of months, his debt servicing costs had leaped from a manageable $200,000 a year to nearly $450,000. Panic was a foreign emotion to Gregory, but as he ran the numbers on his dual monitors, a cold sweat broke out on his neck. It wasn't just the interest rates. The geopolitical landscape had fractured, sending the cost of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer up by 300%. Diesel fuel had nearly doubled. The proprietary software subscriptions required just to start his $500,000 tractors had increased by 20%. He needed a record-breaking harvest and, historically, high corn prices just to break even. Nature, however, doesn't care about a banker's spreadsheet. The summer of 2023 had brought a brutal, unrelenting drought to the Midwest. The sky turned into a cruel, cloudless blue dome for 8 weeks straight. Gregory's heavily chemically treated soil, stripped of its organic matter from years of aggressive over-farming, turned to concrete. The roots of his corn plants couldn't penetrate the hardpan to find water. His yields plummeted by 40%. Across the county fence line, William Paul was operating in a different reality. Because William had spent the last 2 years planting diverse cover crops and grazing cattle, his soil was dark, spongy, and rich in organic matter. It held moisture like a giant sponge. While Gregory's corn withered into brown, crispy stalks, William's scaled-down diverse crops remained stubbornly green. More importantly, William's financial ledger was bulletproof. He had no equipment loans. His old International Harvester tractors didn't require expensive software updates. When a part broke, he and Selene welded it or bought a cheap replacement from a junkyard. Because his cover crops and cattle manure naturally fixed nitrogen into the soil, he hadn't bought a single ton of synthetic fertilizer. William's input costs were down 85% compared to the county average. Even with a lower overall yield due to the drought, William was turning a pure, unencumbered profit. The tension in the county diner shifted from arrogance to a suffocating, quiet dread. Farmers who had once mocked William now sat in the booths, nursing black coffee, their eyes hollow, avoiding eye contact with one another. The topic of conversation was no longer new trucks and land acquisitions. It was margin calls and bankruptcy attorneys. One freezing morning in February 2024, the illusion shattered completely. Tommy Henderson, the appraiser, walked into the diner, his face pale. He slid into a booth across from Gregory, who looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 months. Dark bags hung under Gregory's eyes, and his designer flannel shirt was wrinkled. "They're calling the notes Greg," Tommy said quietly, keeping his voice down so the waitress wouldn't hear. Gregory's head snapped up. "What who?" "Heartland Ag Credit and First National. The regulators came through last week. They're looking at the loan-to-value ratios." Tommy sighed, rubbing his temples. "When you bought that land from William, you valued it at $18,000 an acre. With the interest rates up and crop yields down, the bank reappraised it. It's only worth $10,000 an acre now." Gregory felt the blood drain from his face. "So what?" "As long as I make the payments." "You aren't making the payments, Greg. You missed January's equipment lease. The bank is demanding more collateral to cover the difference in land value. If you can't put up cash, hard cash, they're starting foreclosure proceedings on the original farm to cover the toxic debt from the expansion." "I have 5,000 acres, Gregory hissed, slamming his fist on the table, rattling the coffee cups. "I'm the biggest producer in this valley. They can't do this to me." "You don't own 5,000 acres, Greg," Tommy said softly, with a pity that cut deeper than an insult. "The bank owns it. You just work for them, and they're firing you." That night, in an act of absolute desperation, Gregory Carmichael drove his pristine Ford F-250 down the rutted, muddy driveway of Willow Creek Farms. The freezing rain pelted his windshield. He parked outside William's old farmhouse. William was on the porch, a thick wool coat wrapped around him, smoking a corncob pipe. He watched Gregory step out of the truck and walk up the steps, shivering in the cold. "William." Gregory started his voice, cracking, stripping away years of pride. "I need your help." William didn't invite him inside. He just took a slow pull from his pipe. "Evening, Gregory. Weather's turning, isn't it?" "I need to sell you back the 400 acres, Gregory blurted out. "Cheap, cheaper than I bought it. But I need you to co-sign a bridge loan for me, just to get me through the planting season. You've got capital, William. Everyone knows you're sitting on cash. If you don't help me, they're taking everything. The tractors, the land, the house. Everything." William looked at the man who had mocked him, who had honked his horn in derision, who had built a kingdom on borrowed sand. "I can't do that, Gregory," William said softly. "Why?" Gregory screamed, the panic finally breaking through. "You have the money. You planned this. You knew the market was going to crash." "I didn't know anything," William replied, his voice steady, carrying over the freezing wind. "I just knew that a man cannot serve two masters. You chose to serve the banks, Gregory. You let them tell you how to farm, how to grow, how to live. You traded your freedom for an illusion of empire." William knocked the ashes out of his pipe against the wooden railing. "The bank isn't going to take your farm, Gregory," William said, turning to walk back inside. "The bank already took it 3 years ago when you signed the papers. They're just finally coming to collect the keys." The door clicked shut, leaving Gregory Carmichael standing alone in the freezing rain, realizing that the crazy old man he had laughed at was the only free man left in the county. And the crisis was only just beginning. By May of 2024, Henderson County resembled a graveyard of rusted American dreams. The spring planting season, usually a time of roaring diesel engines and frantic optimism, was cloaked in a suffocating silence. 5 major farming operations had filed for Chapter 12 bankruptcy. The local implement dealerships were choked with repossessed machinery rows of bright green and red tractors sitting idle, their massive tires sinking into the gravel lot as monuments to a debt binge that had spectacularly imploded. Gregory Carmichael's empire was dismantled piece by piece. First went the leased combines hauled away on flatbeds by grim-faced repo men from Chicago. Then went the shiny Ford F-25, replaced by a borrowed dented Chevy Silverado from his brother-in-law. Finally, the bank placed the crown jewel on the chopping block, the original 2,000-acre Carmichael family homestead, along with the 400 acres of premium bottomland Gregory had bought from William Paul. The county courthouse steps on the morning of the foreclosure auction felt like a funeral. Farmers stood in small, huddled groups, hands shoved deep into their Carhartt pockets, eyes cast down at the concrete. No locals were there to bid. The community was tapped out, paralyzed by frozen credit lines and underwater mortgages. Instead, a new breed of predator had arrived in town. Parked along the courthouse square were 3 sleek black Cadillac Escalades. Out stepped Harrison Caldwell, a senior acquisitions director for Prairie Capital Management, a New York-based hedge fund. Wall Street had realized that with inflation, soaring real physical assets like prime Midwestern farmland were the ultimate safe haven. They weren't farmers, they were asset managers. Their strategy was ruthless. Let the local farmers go bankrupt, buy the land for pennies on the dollar at foreclosure auctions, and rent it back to them at extortionate rates as corporate tenant farmers. Harrison Caldwell adjusted his designer tie, holding a leather portfolio. He looked at the gathered locals with the detached, clinical interest of a coroner. Tommy Henderson, the auctioneer, stood at the podium. He looked sick to his stomach. He had known Gregory Carmichael's father. He had hunted on that land. Now he was legally bound to sell it to the highest bidder. "All right, folks," Tommy's voice echoed through the crackling PA system, lacking its usual rhythmic cadence. "We are here to auction the Carmichael estate. Tract 1, 2,400 acres of tillable soil, home site, and outbuildings. We will open the bidding at $12 million. It was a devastatingly low opening bid, barely $5,000 an acre, for land that 2 years prior had appraised for triple that. 12, Harrison Caldwell said, crisply, raising a single manicured finger. Tommy scanned the crowd, begging silently for a local to step up. "I have 12. Do I hear 12.5, 12.5 to keep it local?" Silence. Gregory Carmichael stood near the back, his face grey, leaning against a stone pillar as if his legs could no longer support his own weight. He was watching his grandfather's legacy evaporate into a corporate portfolio. $12 million going once, Tommy said, his voice dropping to a mournful whisper. Going twice. 15 million. A raspy, gravelly voice cut through the humid morning air. Every head in the courtyard whipped around. Standing at the bottom of the steps wearing scuffed leather work boots and a faded canvas jacket was William Paul. Beside him stood his daughter Celine, holding a thick stack of manila folders. Harrison Caldwell narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption, from an old man who looked like he couldn't afford a hot lunch, let alone a multi-million-dollar farm. 16 million, Caldwell countered sharply. 18. William fired back, not missing a beat. The crowd erupted in hushed, frantic whispers. "Where is William getting this kind of money?" Caldwell smirked. He knew the financials of every regional bank in a 200-mile radius. No local bank was issuing a line of credit that large, especially not to an eccentric septuagenarian. Caldwell signaled to the auctioneer. "Mr. Henderson, as a representative of a verified institutional buyer, I must request proof of funds from this gentleman. We don't have time for local theatre." Tommy looked at William nervously. "William, I have to verify. Do you have a letter of credit?" Selene Paul stepped forward, ascending the steps to the auctioneer's podium. She didn't hand him a letter of credit from a bank. She handed him a certified statement from a private offshore depository, alongside a stack of verified wire transfer receipts routed through a federal trust. When Tommy read the documents, his eyes went wide. He looked from the paper to William, absolutely stunned. The town had thought William was crazy for burying PVC pipes in his orchard. They assumed he was hoarding beans and bullets. But William, guided by Selene's corporate financial background, had seen the regional banking crisis coming. The pipes hadn't contained doomsday prep. They had contained physical registered gold and silver bullion, hundreds of pounds of it, accumulated quietly over 30 years during the good harvests, completely off the digital banking grid. When inflation hit and fiat currency began to devalue gold and silver skyrocketed. When the local banks froze up and restricted withdrawals to save their own balance sheets, William dug up the pipes, legally liquidated the precious metals through Selene's trusted brokers at record-high premiums, and parked the cash in a protected private family trust. He hadn't just protected his wealth, he had multiplied its purchasing power by a factor of 4. "The funds are verified," Tommy said into the microphone, his voice trembling with a sudden surge of adrenaline. "Bid stands at 18 million to William Paul." Caldwell's smugness vanished. He aggressively punched a number into his phone, whispering furiously to his risk managers in New York. 19 million, Caldwell barked. 22 million. William said smoothly, pulling a thermos from his jacket and taking a sip of coffee. "And I have all day, son." Caldwell's face flushed red. The numbers no longer made sense for the hedge fund's strict return on investment algorithms. At 22 million, the corporate margins disappeared. Caldwell lowered his hand, glaring at William with raw venom. "You're a fool, old man. You can't farm that much land without debt. You'll choke on it." "I don't farm with debt," William replied. "I farm with dirt." "Sold," Tommy Henderson yelled, slamming his gavel down so hard the wooden block splintered. "For $22 million to the Paul family trust." The courthouse square erupted. Farmers who had been utterly silent moments ago were cheering, throwing their caps into the air. The Wall Street vultures had been beaten back. But as the crowd swarmed, William clapping him on the shoulder, Gregory Carmichael slipped away, walking blindly down the street, entirely broken. William had saved the land from Wall Street, but Gregory had still lost everything. 2 days after the auction, Gregory Carmichael was packing cardboard boxes in the living room of his sprawling, custom-built home. The bank had given him 30 days to vacate the house. His wife had taken the kids to stay with her parents in Ohio until he could figure out how to put their lives back together. He taped up a box of old photographs, the ripping sound of the packing tape echoing loudly in the empty, hollow house. A heavy knock at the front door startled him. Gregory opened it to find William Paul standing on the porch. The old man wasn't gloating. His face was solemn, weathered by 1,000 sunrises, his eyes carrying a weight that Gregory finally understood. "I imagine you're here for the keys, William." Gregory said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You can have them. I'm taking my personal belongings. The tractors belong to the bank. You own the dirt. I didn't come for the keys." "Gregory," William said, stepping past him into the foyer without being invited. He looked around at the vaulted ceilings and the expensive chandeliers. "I came with a contract." William pulled a thick legal document from his jacket and dropped it onto the kitchen island. Gregory walked over, staring at it suspiciously. "What is this? I don't have anything left for you to take." "It's an operating lease," William said. "For the Carmichael farm, all 2,400 acres." Gregory frowned, his mind struggling to process the words. "A lease? I just told you I'm bankrupt. I don't have a dime to my name. I can't rent this land from you." "I know you don't have a dime," William said, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. "Which is why the rent is $0, for the first 5 years anyway." Gregory stopped breathing. He stared at the old man, waiting for the punchline, the trap. "Why, a year ago I laughed in your face. I mocked you in front of the whole town. I drove my truck past your property and called you a lunatic. Why would you give me my farm back?" "Because you know the land, Gregory," William said quietly. "Your grandfather taught you the contours of that bottomland before you could walk. Your father knew exactly where the water pooled in the spring. You lost your way because the system was designed to make you lose your way. They gave you free money and told you it was a ticket to heaven, and when you took it, they slammed the gates shut." William leaned forward, tapping a scarred finger on the contract. "But I am not giving you a free ride. There are conditions, brutal ones." Gregory swallowed hard. "Name them." "Condition 1, William said. You never take out another agricultural loan. Ever. No operating notes, no equipment leases. We operate entirely out of cash flow. If we don't have the cash, we don't buy it. Condition 2. You are done with the chemical treadmill. No more synthetic nitrogen that burns out the topsoil. No more genetically modified patented seeds that you have to buy back from a corporation every year. We are transitioning the entire 2,000 acres to regenerative grazing and heirloom crops. It will take 3 years of hell to fix the soil you poisoned, and the yields will be cut in half." Gregory looked at the contract. "If the yields are cut in half, and I have no loans, how do we survive?" William allowed a rare, thin smile to cross his face. "Because I didn't just bury gold in those pipes, Gregory. I buried seeds." William explained the final piece of his master plan. For decades, alongside his financial preparations, William had been cultivating and storing thousands of pounds of drought-resistant, open-pollinated heirloom seeds. While the surrounding corporate farms were burning up in the shifting extreme climate, entirely dependent on irrigation, they could no longer afford. William possessed the genetic blueprints of crops that had survived the Dust Bowl. "We won't have the highest yields in the state," William said, "but our input costs will be practically zero, and while Wall Street spends millions trying to force dead soil to grow plastic corn, we are going to sell premium organic drought-hardy grain and grass-fed beef directly to the market. You are going to be the foreman of the Willow Creek Cooperative. You keep your house. You keep your dignity. But you work for the soil now, not the bank." Tears, hot and unbidden, finally spilled over the brims of Gregory Carmichael's eyes. The arrogance, the pride, the blinding ambition of the past 20 years shattered completely on the kitchen island. He reached for the pen, his hand shaking violently, and signed his name. Over the next 3 years, Henderson County underwent a resurrection. It wasn't easy. The transition was agonizingly labor-intensive. Gregory traded his air-conditioned cab for hours of grueling physical labor, manually moving cattle fences to implement rotational grazing. He learned to fix the rusty International Harvester tractors alongside William. His hands became permanently stained with grease and dirt. But by the fall of 2026, the contrast was undeniable. The corporate farms owned by Prairie Capital Management were struggling. The dead, compacted soil required more expensive chemicals every season just to produce a break-even crop. When the rains didn't come, the Wall Street dirt turned to dust and blew across the highways. But behind the fences of the Willow Creek Cooperative, the land was a deep, vibrant green. The diverse cover crops held moisture deep in the earth. The cattle grazed lazily, fertilizing the fields naturally. The cooperative had expanded, bringing in 3 other bankrupt local farmers under William's strict debt-free charter. They weren't billionaires. They didn't drive Platinum Edition trucks, but they owned their land outright. They owed absolutely nothing to anyone, and they slept soundly through the night. William Paul, the lunatic of Henderson County, sat on his porch on a crisp November evening, smoking his corncob pipe. He watched Gregory Carmichael out in the distance, teaching his young son how to check the moisture depth of the soil with a steel rod. Not a satellite, not a computer, just a man and the earth. The wind blew through the old apple orchard, rustling the leaves over the empty holes where the PVC pipes used to be. The storm had come and gone, wiping away the empires built on paper. But the roots William had planted deep in the dirt and deep in the community held firm. If William's story taught you anything, it's that true wealth isn't found in flashy equipment or leveraged bank accounts. It's built on independence, resilience, and knowing when to walk away from the crowd. Sometimes the craziest person in the room is the only one reading the warning signs. Did you see the twist coming? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a great underdog story, and subscribe for more incredible tales of real-world survival.